Simon Coveney, Taoiseach, Minister for Foreign Affairs, thank you very much for taking a break from your campaign.
Thank you.
We will not keep you.
Delighted to be here.
Huh?
I'm delighted to be here. Catch a breather.
I sense you have an awful lot of time pressure, so we do understand what you've done for us. Speaking of time pressure, do you have time? You have 3 young daughters and a wife, Ruth, obviously. Do you feel, is there a feeling that you're tugged between the two? Do you spend enough time with them?
I mean, in truth, the biggest challenge of my career, I think it would be fair to say, isn't the rough and tumble of politics. It's trying to be a decent father at the same time as being a good politician. And you know, it is very time consuming, particularly when you're in government, and it needs to be, because a lot of people rely on you to perform and get things done. And so you make sacrifices and you ask and demand that of your family, and I'm afraid they don't have much choice in it. So the balancing act for me is, despite the fact that I spend a lot of time away from home, probably 6 days a week at the moment, when I am at home, I don't go to matches, I don't go for long runs. I spend it with my kids, and they, you know, they accept that. They've kind of grown up with it, but it's something that does require in me a real discipline to be focused and to leave politics at the door of my house when I go home, to make sure I'm building the relationships that I should be with my children.
Your eldest is she 10 or is she older?
10, yeah, 10, 8 and 6, 3 girls.
Your eldest be developing an interest in politics?
No, well, she's asking me if she can do some leaflet drops at the moment. That's about as far as it goes. But and counting posters.
And it's one of the most important jobs.
But no, look, I'm like lots of parents. You know, I look at my children. I'm softened by their innocence. Really, you know, they're
and are you saying don't do it, or if you fancy?
I think it's a tough life. I wouldn't like my children to go into politics, I have to say, but if they want to do it,
and why not?
Well, I mean, I think it involves huge sacrifices, you know, and I love it. I enjoy politics. It's a privilege for me. You know, I made the decision at the age of 25 to stand for the Dáil in tragic circumstances, actually, because I got elected in a by-election. But I've never regretted it. I got a huge buzz out of it.
Your father passed away.
He did, yeah. So you know, but I see a lot of unhappy politicians, to be honest with you, in terms of their private life and the pressure that then puts on their public life as well. For me, I'm lucky. I have an amazing family, an amazing wife, kids that are unconditional in their affection for me so far. I'm surrounded by girls, which is very unusual for me because I grew up in a house of boys. You know, I'm one of 6 brothers. I have a sister as well who's well able to stand up for herself. But my house was full of competitiveness, sport, testosterone, and it was always a competition, whether on the sports field, whether it was academic, and we've all developed, I'm glad to say, good careers. We're very lucky, but my family now, in many ways, is driven by girls, and you know what? I wouldn't change it for the world. I'm blessed by it.
Well, much like many of our platforms here, so that's a good thing, I think. Women guiding you. When it came to Leo Varadkar becoming Taoiseach, many of your supporters may have been disappointed that you decided to leave housing. Whether you decided or not, your Taoiseach may have demanded it. I don't know, but. That decision, what was behind it?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm honest, like I dwell on that decision a lot.
Yeah.
Because I was hugely driven when I was in housing. I mean, I'm driven now on a different brief, but you know, there was and still is a big job to do, trying to rebuild a housing market in Ireland that's fair, that's accessible for people. You know, we have had a very broken housing market that has caused huge pressure for many families, huge stress. I've no doubt it's contributed to family breakup in many cases. People being unable to afford rent, people being unable to put a deposit together and save, not able to buy a house. And I think in the last 3 to 4 years, we've done a huge amount to try and change that and improve it. You know, 16,000 young people have access to supports for first-time buyers that we put in place. I got a lot of criticism when I introduced that, Help to Buy scheme, and 16,000 people. Now everybody wants to expand it, right? And we're committed to expanding it actually because it's a good scheme. When I remember speaking only a few months ago to the Chief Executive of Cork City Council, and she reminded me that in 2014, Cork City Council built one social house. One. Yeah. They currently have well over 1,000 under construction now. That's the pace of change that we're trying to deliver through local authorities. We're spending 2.7 billion euros this year on housing. We'll add 11,000 social houses to the social housing stock. They're all badly needed. But I hear a lot of talk about housing and the failures of government to deliver solutions. The truth is that we are seeing rapid change in terms of housing delivery. We're seeing new and important supports for people to access housing. We've introduced a lot of extra protections for renters. And of course, I was the first minister in the history of the state to effectively introduce a rent cap. We've introduced a limit of no more than 4% on what landlords can increase rent by across, I think it's about 65% of rental properties in the country now. So we've done a lot on housing. I'm still driven by it. I still think a lot about the many, many families and individuals that I've met as housing minister and subsequently who desperately need the state's intervention.
But you say,
and we're going to solve this problem. We're on our way to doing it, but it's going to take a few more years.
But you say in 2014 there's one local authority house built in Cork. The crisis was emerging then, and there is collective cabinet responsibility. Fine Gael were in power. Is there anything you would have, as a government now, I'm not zeroing in on Owen Murphy, that you maybe should have done differently? And people from the outside like me, people who work in Leinster House, remember a time that our banks almost collapsed. We all sat in Leinster House observing you politicians saving those banks over a period of days. Has that emergency attitude been brought to housing, do you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, and I think sometimes all of the blame gets directed at Fine Gael because we've been in government for quite some time. I mean, I think we have to remember who was forced to try to save the banks and why.
Yeah.
Because
all Green coalition.
Yeah, and the country was devastated by that. And as a result, they threw Fianna Fáil out and they put their trust in Fine Gael and the Labour Party, which was almost like a national government at that time to try to rebuild the country. I mean, don't forget, when we came into government, there was a deficit of 23 billion euros. In other words, we were spending 23 billion euros more than we were taking in, right? Today, there's a surplus of 1.5 billion. In the last 3 years of the government before we took office, 356,000 people lost their jobs, 200,000 of those on building sites. All of our banks were bust. And so we were in crisis management mode. And the focus for the first 3 or 4 years of the Fine Gael government had to be, how do we get people back to work? How do we get this state out of bankruptcy? How do we get the IMF out of this country so we can start making our own decisions again? And all of those things happened. And we have made this extraordinary transition from bankruptcy to now being, in my view, one of the most balanced economies in the European Union, one of the fastest growing economies in the European Union, one of the youngest populations in the European Union, and one of the fastest growing populations in percentage terms because people want to be in Ireland to be part of that. Now, have we solved a lot of the social challenges that good public services have to respond to? No, we haven't. In healthcare, we are at the start of a reform process that's going to take a decade. We managed to get agreement across all political parties working with us to put a plan in place to fix healthcare once and for all. It's called Sláinte Care. Where we're going to get to on that is essentially a public health service that doesn't distinguish between people on the basis of what they can afford to pay or their wealth. And that when public hospitals are operating, people who come for essential medical interventions get it on the basis of need. And we're going to get there. But it involves another 2,500 beds in the system, thousands of extra staff to go with that. And all of that requires money. And one of the big, I think, missing elements of the debate in this election campaign. And look, I'm happy to accept blame and criticism when people have frustrations, they want us to do things faster and so on. But every party is promising loads of things in this campaign. There'll be manifestos launched today and over the next few days. And if you don't have a strong economy to pay for it all, you have nothing. Yeah. And surely we've learned that after the last crash. In fact, there's been a number of crashes in my lifetime because of irresponsible politics, the country borrowing money it can't afford, having unsustainable approaches towards taxation and so on. And Fine Gael, if it does one thing during this term of Fine Gael government, it is to try and end that boom and bust cycle that causes so much devastation for families and businesses. It's not just about economic numbers. When you don't have work to go to, when your husband or your wife has to go to England or further afield to get an income to send money home, when you're saying goodbye to your kids because they can't get a career in Ireland, this is the consequences of populist politics in Ireland. And it's what Fine Gael are trying to move the country away from. And that's why, we launched our manifesto today. It's fully costed, it's ambitious in loads of areas, but we're the first to admit that a lot of the commitments we make in this are subject to an economic growth model that works. And that's why we keep talking about the importance for the next 12 months of the Brexit negotiation, because we have a €70 billion trade relationship with the UK, 40,000 Irish companies trade with the UK every fortnight, every month. It's about 200,000 people. And if we don't get the trade negotiation right in Brexit, an awful lot of the promises that Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin and Fine Gael and all the other parties are making, they're aspirational, no more than that.
Brexit is the current and most visible crisis. When you look at the polls and people's reactions on the doors, some of whom I've spoken to, has it been a mistake for Fine Gael to put Brexit at the centre of its campaign in the way it has?
No, I think we're trying to be honest with people. Some people don't want to hear that because they feel that they've heard about Brexit for the last 2 or 3 years and they're sick of it. But whether we like it or not, Brexit is going to dominate Irish politics for the next 12 months in the same way that it's dominated Irish politics for the last 2 years. Every manifesto that's launched during this campaign, every promise that's made during this campaign that involves significant expenditure is reliant on us being able to afford to do it. And if we don't get the right kind of Brexit deal in the second half of this match, if you want to use a sporting parlance, well then the Irish economy is going to be fundamentally disrupted. We have a level of integration with the UK from an economic perspective, and you have it as a media company too. Yes. We have a level of integration between Ireland and the UK that cannot be pulled apart easily, and that is why we need to get an outcome here that's good for Britain, because that's good for Ireland, and good for Ireland and the EU. And I think we can do that. I think we have a negotiating team on Brexit that has proven its worth. And I would ask people, for me, actually, what this election is about, and I think we'll start to focus on it more as we get closer to polling day, is actually about who do you trust. Yeah. And on some things around public services, Fine Gael would like to have done more and wants to get the opportunity to do more. But on the core issue of economic management, of keeping people in their jobs, making sure that we can spend billions more every year providing better public services, who do you trust to keep that ship steady through a very turbulent period ahead? And I hope that, and I think we've had a lot of really good debates on housing and healthcare and policing, and these are important elements of this campaign. But as we draw the campaign to a close, I think people will focus more and more on who do you trust in a period of real uncertainty for Ireland. And I think in that debate, Fine Gael will do well.
I think people trust you. Do you think you'll ever have the top job? Do you think you'll ever be Taoiseach? You lost out in 2017, but it is a progression in political career.
Look, I'm a competitive person. I've never lost an election apart from that one election for the leadership of my party. I accepted that. The rules were the rules. Leo won that fairly. I think he's done a good job. We've become close. I work with him. I tell him sort of the unvarnished truth when that's needed. And I think we trust each other. And in particular on the Brexit stuff, that has really helped us to work very tightly together and to trust each other in terms of the relationships we've built up and the choices we've made together. So, like people talk about Fine Gael being in government for a long period, the last 9 years. But the truth is that Leo Varadkar has actually only been Taoiseach for 2 years. He's actually really new to the job. And a lot of people don't see it that way because he's achieved an awful lot. But, I really hope he gets an opportunity to show what he can do for a full 5-year term with a strong economy. The spine that he's shown, quite frankly, during Brexit, when there was massive pressure on him to compromise in areas where, if he did compromise, Ireland's interests would have been undermined. I think he is a person that we can trust. And, regardless of the competitive nature of politics between Leo and myself in the past, I'm happy to work with him as a Taoiseach. I think he's someone who can do an awful lot if he's given the opportunity to do more.
Paul McCartney and John Lennon were part of a band, but they were competitive also. They've always said that since. Yeah. In the leadership contest, there was a kind of effort to characterise you as Paul McCartney, Leo as John Lennon, and rock and roll won out. So it is in that context I ask the question he was asked the other night: have you ever used illegal drugs?
No, look, I'm just not getting into this who used what and when and comparing politicians. I've never had any interest in drugs, in truth. It's a loser's game. It's devastating families. It's fueling crime and funding crime and fueling an awful lot of psychotic violence, quite frankly. And we've seen that in the last number of weeks. It's been a big part of this debate, but I really don't want to get into comparing and contrasting
what can you do
who
as
did
a
what
government
when they were in college and all the rest of it. It's just not somewhere where I'm going to go.
I think the question itself isn't what interested people. It was the Taoiseach's reaction. Do you understand the reaction that he had during that debate? It was very marked that he seemed ill prepared for the question. Well,
I was watching it. I think the confusion was actually he wasn't sure whether he was being asked the question. Yeah. That's what I got from it. But look,
Micheál Martin had interjected.
Yeah, he had, and Leo's been pretty open on this, and I don't think he has anything to hide here. People want a Taoiseach. They want political leaders who tell the truth and are upfront. That's Leo Varadkar all over. So, and I've done a lot of canvassing since that debate. I think Leo was the clear winner in that debate. People have focused on that particular question. It is actually tough to find news. That's a fair comment. But and people sometimes hear what they want to hear. But I think Leo has shown a real command of detail, of policy. I think he himself said, and he was almost smiling when he said it, like sometimes he's not that good on empathy in terms of finding the right words. And I think that was him sort of truthfully reflecting. Everybody has weaknesses, but actually, if you trust Leo Varadkar on what he's actually delivered, then I think you see a very empathetic person who cares about all strands of Irish society.
And he referred to in that debate his willingness to support a grand coalition with Fianna Fáil. Do you support that? Was it something you'd consider?
Well, I remember a number of years ago, it was actually when Enda Kenny was Taoiseach, before the election before last, I was asked the question, would you ever go into government with Fianna Fáil? And I said, well, yeah, if there was no other option and we needed to put a government together. I didn't see why that was such a taboo thing to say, even though a lot of people criticised me for it. But let me be clear. My strong preference after the next election, when Fine Gael is the largest party, if we manage to achieve that, which I hope we will.
And how many seats? do you think
just let me answer the question, because I'd like to be upfront with people on this. I would like to put together a rainbow government that involves the Labour Party, the Greens, maybe the Social Democrats. I think it would be really balanced on environment, on social issues, on economic management. I tried to do that after the last election. I asked the Green Party to come into government with us. I spoke to Eamon Ryan about that. I think he's a good person. I have a good relationship with him. I don't agree with everything that the Green Party says, but I think they're a good influence on Irish politics, and I'd like to be in government with them. So, my preference, and I'm speaking personally here as opposed to Fine Gael.
Absolutely.
My preference is for a Fine Gael-led government, but very much in coalition with a number of other smaller parties that can provide a balance that can ensure that a cross-section of Irish society feels that they're being represented in government, and that for me would be the optimal government. If it's not possible, well then we have to look at other options, and we've said that we will work with anybody to provide stable government, with the exception of Sinn Féin, because we just don't believe the parties are compatible.
And what's an achievable target for seats for Fine Gael?
Well, I think we need to be looking at the mid-50s probably. Okay. I think that's possible, and I think if we do that, working with smaller parties, it's possible to get a majority. The one thing I would say is that I would have a strong preference for whoever leads the next government, and whatever coalition that is, that there's a majority government in place.
Okay.
I have spent an enormous amount of my time over the last number of years managing relationships linked to confidence and supply, trying to get majority support in Parliament for things that the country needs. And in my view, we need 5 years of a government that can make decisions, that can get things done, that can vote things through. I think there is a place for confidence and supply. And I think Brexit was a good example of where that can be very useful. But the next term in government, I think, needs a decisive, strong government that can make decisions for people and get things done. And for that reason, I think a majority government over some kind of minority government with confidence supply arrangements in place would be far preferable.
We'll let you go and get those seats, so they're waiting for you at the manifesto launch. So, thank you very much,
Thanks,
Simon Coveney, and best of luck with everything.
Anytime. Thank you.
Cheers.